When I was 9 years old in 1999, I ran away from home. My father was a machinist and worked late nights, and my mother was my teacher. I was homeschooled and only knew these two people. My father was an abusive alcoholic and used to beat me, but never laid a hand on my mother. We lived in an undeveloped business area in rural Alaska, miles from suburbia. It wasn't uncommon for business to start and tank within the same year. So when I left, I found an abandoned building and decided to make my home there. I found a small broken window that led to the basement of a 4-story building, and I broke in. There were signs that other people had come into this building before me, and me, not really knowing how to talk to people, had me very frightened. I explored for hours. The 3rd and 4th floor were in bad condition. There were holes in the walls, as if someone had come in and just smashed them. Broken chairs, tables, cabinets, all sorts of things. I found a room with a push lock on the door and decided to make my camp there. This was during a period where we only had sun for about 6 hours a day. So without natural light, this building was pitch dark and beyond freezing. In what I imagined was the middle of the night when I had dozed off, I heard glass shattering and the sound of a man screaming as if he were writhing in pain. It sounded as if he was breaking everything he could get his hands on. His voice seemed to split where he was screaming and wheezing, as if it were two people. This terrified me. Even though I had the door locked and was on a different floor, I still worried for my safety. I flicked my lighter on and burned some manila folders to look around the room. I found a hole in the wall that was just big enough for me to fit in, so I dove in and crawled as far back as I could go. The man screamed for hours and wheezed. It sounded like he was being tortured, but he was the only one there. Eventually, the screaming stopped. I heard his footsteps echo in the staircase between rooms. He made it to the floor I was on, and it sounded as if he were dragging something behind him. He went into a different room and shattered some glass. He kept doing this for a while, but never made a sound himself. I pissed myself in the wall now, terrified he would punch through the wall of the next room and discover me. Eventually, it was silent for too long. I never heard him leave, and although I was tired, I feared falling asleep, for if I snored, he might discover me, and what would he do? After some quiet hours, the doorknob to the room I was in shook. It shook a few more times, and then I heard a rattle. He took a key, placed it in the door, and unlocked it. He stepped in and stayed silent for a few minutes. He left the room walking. Then he started running around in other rooms and dragged something into the room adjacent to mine. Through the wall, I could only hear a cracking sound. Then he started to chew very loudly and exclaimed what he was eating was delicious. I didn't make a sound. I hadn't found any food in that building during my exploration, so he must have brought something in.
"Would you like some?"
he said in a hushed tone. I didn't respond. I imagined he was talking to himself.
"Ever get the feeling you're being watched?"
He laughed to himself.
"I just know someone is here."
He rattled on while chewing and making that horrible cracking sound.
"I'd really like a dinner guest sometime."
I had a lump in my throat. I could not swallow. I had to clear it so bad, but I feared what this guy would do if I did. So I stayed quiet. I was so utterly terrified and cold from all of the windows being smashed and being wet from my piss, I almost cried.
I'm going to give you to the count of 5.
I didn't dare move.
1,
I closed my eyes so tightly.
2,
He couldn't have known I was in here.
3,
I didn't know about God at the time, but I believe I prayed to some sort of higher being.
4,
I swallowed hard and took a deep breath.
5.
And he went silent. There were no noises for a long time. It may have been an hour, but I'm not sure. I nodded off from pure exhaustion, and when I woke up, it was still pitch black. I started to scuffle a little bit, totally forgetting where I was, and I froze when I realized. I didn't hear anything, so I waited for another few minutes, then left the wall. I exited the small hole and walked out of the room. The upstairs area was littered with drywall, glass, cigarette butts, alcohol cans, and other debris. I couldn't remember where the stairwell was to leave, so I had to explore all over again. I eventually ended up in the room where the man spent the majority of his time, and that's when it all clicked. The room was covered in shit and blood. A deer carcass had been ripped apart in the room, and its intestines draped all over it. They hung through ceiling tiles and over desks like a canopy. I only realized when I smacked my face into a piece of its organs strewn across the walls. Remember, it was pitch black. I lit some more folders on fire and looked across the room. The skull had teeth marks punctured into it, and the eyes and teeth had been thrown around the room. I didn't know what to make of any of this, so I broke down crying. I left the building and continued onward towards my home. When I arrived, my mother yelled at me for being gone for 3 days. She quickly stopped when she saw I was covered in blood. When I explained the story, my father sat down with me and explained that this is why he keeps us away from other people, because
This is what they do.
I was terrified of people and lived with my parents and did not speak to any other people besides the 2 of them until I was 20 years old, and moved out when my mother died, and my father told me I was never really his son. I've lived a very strange life. I'm 27 now and live on my own in Alaska. Something I need to talk about. Let me preface this. English is not my first language, but I did study it in school, so please excuse my errors. I think it's been long enough since it happened that I can safely talk about this. This takes place in 1994 Poland. Myself and several friends were poking around in one of the areas that, because of the Soviet occupation, no one had been in for a couple of decades. Because of this, it was all overgrown and wild, so we were armed with a mix of rifles, pistols, and knives. I personally had brought along my uncle's carabiners. We hiked into the forest from the edge of an old fence line. A couple kilometers in, we found an old asphalt road. It was cracked and weathered with trees starting to grow up through the roadbed, but we decided to follow it in. It ended about 7 kilometers later at a large grassy clearing. We chose to camp here for the night. In the morning, we noticed that something had paced around the perimeter of our camp. The grass was bent down and flattened from where it had walked. We didn't think much of it though, thought it was deer. We packed up and continued on into the forest. We decided to hill up the side of a mountain we could see from the clearing, get above the trees, and see what we could see. As we walked, I felt like we were being watched. We reached a good spot to look around from, and not far from where we had camped, we could see another clearing with some kind of concrete structure there. So we hiked back and made our way over that direction. At the edge of the camp clearing, we found another old road that led in that direction. At the other clearing, the road we were following dipped down into a cut and led to a concrete bunker. After a brief discussion, we decided it was too small to be what we saw from the mountain, and so continued further into the clearing. The picture is similar to the bunker the second road ended at, only the ramp down to it was wider and more gently sloped. Anyway, back to the story. We didn't walk long before we were on top of the large concrete pad. There was a massive 4-way door atop it that was partially open, maybe a foot or so. If it were fully open, I think you could easily drive an oversized hauler through it, with room to spare. We looked down it, but it was really too dark to see anything, except a couple flickering lights down at the bottom, and the reflection of water way down at the bottom. Machinery, and a missile cradled by a bunch of machinery. It was too dark to tell how intact everything was. We threw a couple rocks in, and they bounced off some stuff as they fell before splashing into the water at the bottom. We made our way to the edge of the pad to discuss things again. We decided, since there was power, but it was obviously abandoned, we might as well explore. So, we went back to the bunker door we'd found. Me and one of my friends worked at the door, while the others got the flashlights ready, since we weren't sure what to expect regarding lighting. Because we didn't have any tools, it was harder to get open, but we managed with a couple sticks and a pipe we found lying around. The door opened with a hissing whoosh, as the air pressure was different inside than out. At first, we'd thought it was a snake or something and had jumped back. After letting the air inside and out mix, and let the feeling of being idiots go away, we pulled the door fully open and looked inside. There was a layer of dust inside, and more lights were on here than in the silo. Walls painted flat gray. Writing on the walls just inside. None of us really were any good with Russian, and our bad translation was something like West Missile Station Anti-Capitalist Array. I got pushed into going in first because I was the only one with a semi-automatic weapon. The complex itself wasn't really big, maybe a little larger than a 2-bedroom apartment. There was a room with 2 sets of bunk bed cots, no mattresses, but there were steel foot lockers with nothing in them bolted to the floor. The room across from this was a kitchen and dining area. Heavy iron table, electric stove, and folding chairs. Then a hallway to a command room with an armored window into the silo itself. The hum of electricity was strongest in the command room. An entire wall was dedicated to a large control panel and an old analog computer, like the one from Team Fortress 2 that informs a soldier about the blue spy in the base. Its monitor was like that. Some of the bulbs were broken, so I don't know what they would have indicated. They were all in block Cyrillic letters and easier to translate. But the ones that were dimly lit up were silo doors, stopped, obstruction, in/on tracks. I don't remember what the others said. Under the window into the silo, there was a flip clock that was paused at 2 minutes and 34 seconds, with a red light next to it. And there was no actual launch button that we could find. There was another door that we couldn't get open, and looked around deeper into the silo. So after poking around a bit more and double checking for anything interesting, we made our way out and back towards where we camped the night before. All the while, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We set up camp and went to sleep. To this day, I don't know if it was a dream or actually happened, but something was laying on top of me and just watching me. No one else in the camp, just me. It was heavy, and I couldn't move away. But the eyes, they looked smart. I don't know what. When we woke up, the camp was torn apart. Our food was missing, and the cooking supplies we had were scattered all over. And something had walked through the camp, its paws digging into the earth beneath. 2 of our weapons were missing as well, a revolver and a hunting rifle. We were all freaked out. Between the food being gone and a storm looking like it was coming in, we decided to hike out that day. About 2 kilometers of hiking, the storm hit and began raining, as though the sky itself was angry at our trespassing. We had not packed for rain, so we were soon wet and hungry and tired. I still felt like I was being watched. Our hike was slow and tiring. We reached about where we thought we would find the road and began hiking out. Everything looked different, but there were some of the knife marks that we'd made in the trees to mark our passage. A couple kilometers from where we expected the edge of the forest to be, we tripped over our food. Well, the containers and some of the vegetables. All neatly stacked and out in the open, like it had been left for us to find. After we got over trying to wrap our minds around it, we began walking with our weapons ready. Not long after we found our food, we saw something. It looked like a dog or a fox, but it was far too large, like a small car, too long, and the fur was a fake-looking silver, similar to a cheap wig. When it opened its mouth, there were far too many teeth. It smiled at us. I think it was smiling, and just wandered off into the woods. After a mild panic attack, we started walking again, hiking a bit faster than we should have. It didn't take long for us to be running in a panic. I don't know how long it took to get out of the forest, but we did. A couple of my friends went to the authorities and told them about the wolf in the woods. I think they told the whole story though, because a couple of days later, they were just gone. Their parents were shaken and knew something, but wouldn't say or even acknowledge that they even had a child. They were just gone. Even now, I think it was the remnants of the KGB keeping secrets. I only went into those woods once more after that. My curiosity got the better of me a couple years later. I never found the road, or whatever the fox was, and I returned home. I have held this story close since then, but I think it's safe to tell now. But I don't know. I might get woken up by a bag on the head. I don't know.